I find in these circles there can be this kind of disproportionate focus on IQ to the extent that it almost becomes the sole determinant of someone's moral worth and how successful they are as a human being. And to a certain extent, this is extrapolated to the rest of society. And the idea is that to ensure a successful society, you have to try to get the average IQ as high as possible. You have to try to get high IQ people to have more children. It just always needs to be raised up, up, up. And I think the reason for this is of all the kind of measures that you have when we're talking about different peoples, you have things like social trust, time preference, etc., impulse control. The easiest one to really measure in a somewhat scientific way is IQ. Because you can criticize IQ tests as much as you want, but on kind of a meta level, on a big level, they tend to be pretty accurate. Just from, if we go with common sense for a minute, does it make sense that China, Korea, and Japan have the highest IQ scores on Earth? Yes, that does kind of bear out in probably your observations in day to day life. Does it make sense that sub Saharan Africa is the lowest? Yes, that bears out in life. Is it generally speaking that people who perform better on IQ tests tend to be smarter and tend to go into more intellectual professions? Yes. That's not to say IQ tests aren't perfect. There's a lot of people who have IQ that's not uniform. Like, I know when I had, because they do IQ testing in Canadian schools, I scored 99.99, and however, it wasn't even. Like, my verbal IQ was at a post secondary level in grade 3, but my ability to draw and my ability to handwrite was at a sub kindergarten level. So there's a lot of cases where it's not even, and so people on some tests might perform middling, but that doesn't really accurately capture what their abilities are. It's not IQ is it kind of assumes that your intelligence is uniform when it isn't necessarily. And I just bring up my own experience as kind of an example of that. But I know people the other way who might have didactic, how do you pronounce it? Didactic memory, but their verbal reasoning skills aren't great. So there's kind of a wide range, but generally speaking, if you look at it as a group, people in a certain IQ range, it does seem to, the practical outcomes seem to reinforce the theoretical underpinning. So, like I said, when we look at high trust, when we look at impulse control, when we look at time preference, etc., IQ is kind of the easiest one to validate, and there's a lot of existing data for it. There's also the issue that just a lot of people in these circles tend to have high IQs because they're interested in kind of esoteric or kind of weird ideas that, as you'd say, normies aren't interested in. A lot of people with high IQs also will have. I find people with higher IQs, it tends to be correlated with OCD, sometimes social awkwardness, bipolar disorder. There's kind of a lot of kind of personality or mental illness defects that tend to be correlated with high IQ. I mean, there's a lot that tend to be correlated with low IQ, but you'll have a lot of kind of socially awkward people who have trouble relating to others who tend to come into these circles, and they naturally idealize higher IQ because people tend to prefer people like themselves. So they may just dislike normies or kind of people within kind of a normal IQ range, like 85 to 115, because they can't really relate to them very well. They can't really have a decent conversation with them. And maybe they got bullied by them in school, and so they tend to look down on them, and they want society to be more like them, and so they want more people like themselves. So they want society to have a higher IQ. Hopefully that makes sense. There's kind of a bias towards it. Kind of like how people who like sports ball are like, why don't you watch sports ball? Why don't you come to my Super Bowl party and crunch a beer can on your head? So it goes both ways. And I think those are kind of the two major reasons why it becomes such a focus is, like I said, it's just a very easy, largely scientific, objective measure of a large basket of things. People with higher IQs tend to, I think, live longer on average. They tend to, I believe, have lower time preference, have higher social trust, etc. The countries with the highest IQs tend to be the wealthiest, the most successful, that sort of thing. I mean, if we look at the countries with the highest IQs on Earth, you have Japan, South Korea. China's gradually developing, although it's not very good at the moment. I think Northern Italy has the highest IQ of any white country. France, Germany, Scandinavia, England. These countries are all very successful and they all have high IQs. So, like I said, it's something objective you can see. It's also people wanting society to be more like them and people wanting there to be more people like themselves. And I guess there's kind of a third aspect to this, which is the dumbing down of society. Like it is kind of, to a certain extent, it's a meme to say like, oh, everybody was super well educated in the past, but it's kind of something where the truth is close to the middle. It's like the left says, oh, everybody was stupid prior to the 1960s, where we started to have like feminist or really kind of hardcore left-wing education in the classroom. And other people say, oh, the men of old were scholared poets, etc. But if you read much about historical figures, almost all of them were bookworms. Napoleon loved reading books. George Washington liked reading. Thomas Jefferson said, I forget if it was Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin said, I cannot live without books. Being scholarly was very common. If we look at ancient Rome, for instance, writing poetry was considered very kind of a patrician interest. Reading Greek philosophy was. Caesar was liked reading a lot. It's there is an impression that not just among the upper classes, but among the lower classes, there was more of a historical appreciation for high culture. And Dennis Prager called kind of modern and postmodern art the democratization of beauty. It was the idea that anybody could create art. Anybody could create something that would be equally valid. You don't have to have something like high art, like Greek sculpture, which takes an immense amount of talent, time, effort, etc. And only a very, very small percentage of the population can make something approaching it. Instead, we have like blue dot or like green circle, because that's a democratic form of art that your kid can make that in kindergarten. So there has been this dumbing down of the popular culture into the lowest common denominator. You also have, when people discovered that sex sells, you just have pornographic or pseudo pornographic elements just put into everything. Like if you watch commercials, it's basically I think it was on Family Guy, they made a parody of this, and it's like, if you buy this beer, girls will have sex in your backyard, is basically what the commercials are telling you. There's sports ball, which is very much like a bread and circuses thing. I think there is this feeling that high culture, as it were, has basically collapsed. And I'm not saying this as to be an elitist, because I, like, as you see in the number of movies reviews I do, I really like a lot of kind of modern cultural things. I like movies, I like anime, I like video games, etc. But there is this general agreement that culture has declined, and people, I think, somewhat logically will say, well, this is in part due to a decline in the average IQ. Some people go further and say because of modern medicine, the lower classes don't get purged enough. So, like, we have to use abortion or birth control to control the growth of the lower classes, etc. It's interesting because historically, I think upper class people tended to have more children in a lot of cases, because they could afford to feed them and they would tend to survive longer. And they would eventually kind of spread their genes to lower peoples. But anyways, let's get to kind of what the ultimate point was now that I've done this setup. Is I think there's this tendency, for the reasons I listed, to fetishize IQ and to view it as kind of the sole measure of moral and practical worth of somebody. And it's like, oh, we just have to make sure that you have eugenics to select for people with high IQ. And it's nonsense, because there's lots of things that you would want to select for beyond IQ when you're having when you're saying like what kind of people do we want to reproduce. There's, is the person moral? Are they a hardworking person? Are they honest? Are they trustworthy? Are they brave, etc.? And a lot of times, people with 100 IQ, I think it's George Orwell who said, some things are so ridiculous that only smart people will believe them. Or I'm butchering the quote, but you get what I mean. Like, as people in like above 115 or whatever get into that field when too intelligent, and they start to believe like esoteric weird stuff, whereas a lot of people with kind of normal deviation IQs will, if they're socialized properly, will just go along with whatever the socialization is. So they're oftentimes, if they're raised in a decent society, people in this range are often much better people than people up here. Because people up here tend to be kind of weird. And I don't accept myself from that. I'm kind of a weirdo. Whereas, like, I know a lot of people, or some people in these circles who are kind of in this range, and they're very religious. They don't have a lot of kind of the existential issues that people up here do. Their goal in life is to get married. They actively pursue women at a young age. They want to have like 5 kids or whatever, and they just kind of do what's socially expected of them, and they do what's socially right. And in a lot of cases, I'd rather have those people reproduce than some like neat sock who can't hold down a steady job, who happens to have 145 IQ. And ultimately, this comes down to something which I believe very much in, because you have all these people who talk about nationalism, identity, society, etc. But society needs all kinds of different people in it, and I mean people within your family, your nation. It needs people in this range to be scientists and engineers. You need people down like here to be kind of a menial labor and working class. You need people in here to do, I don't know, like white collar jobs that aren't particularly complicated. You need all sorts of people in society. You need people to, like I said, to lead, to follow, etc. And kind of what my mind, what kind of nationalism and what identitarianism is about as kind of a social level, is getting all of your people, be they African, be they Chinese, be they white, be they Italian, American, whatever, and integrating them into your society and finding something for them to do. Because if we had a society like entirely composed of these people, everyone would just be like in a like a constant state of existential crisis. Nothing would get done. If there was a war, they might be able to build some like super advanced robots, but you need a lot of, like I said, ordinary people who are often much better people. They're much better parents. They live much more pure lives than a lot of the supposedly superior people here. I'm not trying to glorify the plebs or anything. I'm just saying it's you can't just say, oh, we need the high IQ people to reproduce. If there's an issue where they're just not reproducing at all and society's becoming unbalanced, that's a thing. But like I said, if somebody in this case is a good father, they're going to raise their kids with proper morals. Their kids are not going to be degenerate gangbangers. Then I think that's preferable to like some 130 IQ liberal who's going to raise their like one test tube baby to be a tranny. And it's just something to keep in mind. It takes all sorts of people to make a successful society. It's good that you have these differences. It's good that you have people who aren't really bothered by kind of higher questions necessarily and just are happy doing menial labor. It's good that you have people who just go about their days, pay their taxes, and live normal, decent lives. It's good you have people who are scientists, who are philosophers, and these things aren't necessarily better or worse than one another. It's just different. And a successful society acknowledges and celebrates these differences because diversity is our strength. But I mean diversity within the nation or the group. And I think this is something that we've acknowledged throughout human history. And it's only something kind of in the last 100 years where we've gone, no, everybody can do everything and everybody should do everything. And to me, it's not about that. It's about ensuring that working class people, white collar people, upper class people all have dignity and can make a decent living, and that they aren't exploited or abused in their chosen profession or what society needs of them. And that's kind of what integralism is about, and that's kind of what Catholic social teaching is about, which is a big influence on me. Is it's about the idea that it's okay. It's okay if you're not, if you can't do something. You're not supposed to be able to do everything, and that's a good thing. Because if all, like I said, if all society was like 145 IQ, they would just be incapable. Like things would just stop functioning. And if society was 70 IQ, well, we know what societies where everyone's 70 IQ is like, and they're not very pleasant, to be perfectly honest. Even among like the highest IQ societies on Earth that are like what 105, 110, it's not like it's in this to this level. Although Asians have some other characteristics like extremely low time preference and extremely high impulse control and just a general really strong sense of duty that kind of offsets some of the other characteristics of their high overall IQ. And once again, there's different types of IQ. Asians might be better at some areas, whereas white people are better at others, etc. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting, and more content to come.